June 11th, 1989. A warm Sunday morning in Ardmore, Oklahoma. Inside the First Baptist Church, 42 worshipers sat fanning themselves against the summer heat. The air smelled of oak pews, perfume, and candle wax. Pastor David Langston stood at the pulpit, voice calm, Bible open, sunlight glinting off the edge of his wedding band. Halfway through his sermon, he paused, just for a breath, and looked down at his 10-year-old daughter, Katie. She smiled up at him, the kind of smile that reminds a father what heaven must feel like. He smiled back. Then it happened. A flicker in the microphone. A single gasp. And in the next heartbeat, he was gone. No sound of footsteps. No door creak. His Bible lay open mid-verse, the mic still humming with static. For a full 10 seconds, no one moved. Then panic rippled through the congregation. Someone screamed his name. Someone else prayed out loud. You can almost hear it. The collision of faith and fear inside a single echoing hall. Before anyone could understand what they'd just witnessed, a second scream pierced the sanctuary. Katie's seat was empty. She, too, had vanished. Within minutes, Ardmore police would swarm the church, baffled by a disappearance that defied logic. No footprints, no forced entry, just silence and an empty pulpit. The kind of mystery that years later would still haunt investigators and fill the pages of cold case files. But that morning, all anyone knew was that a father and daughter had simply ceased to exist, right in front of God and everyone. If stories like this keep you up at night, subscribe now and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Because what happened next would test the limits of faith and of reality itself. Before the chaos, there was peace, the kind that only small towns in the American South seemed to hold. Ardmore, Oklahoma, in the summer of 1989 was a postcard of quiet living. A population just shy of 10,000. Streets where neighbors waved from porches, where kids rode their bikes past the same diner every afternoon. The kind of place where time moved slower, where people still trusted unlocked doors and familiar faces. Every Sunday morning, the First Baptist Church stood as the center of that rhythm. Its white steeple caught the sunrise like a beacon, and the bell that rang at 9 sharp was a sound every heart in Ardmore knew. Inside, ceiling fans turned lazily overhead, stirring the scent of hymnals and polished wood. The church was more than a place of worship. It was the town's pulse. Weddings, funerals, potluck dinners, even the Friday youth socials all happened under its roof. And at the center of it all stood Pastor David Langston. To the congregation, David wasn't just a preacher, he was family. The man people called when marriages broke, when crops failed, when grief came uninvited. His sermons weren't fiery like those of TV evangelists. They were steady, measured, delivered with the voice of a man who'd seen too much of the world and was determined to find peace in it. David had served in Vietnam. Those who knew him back then said the war had left marks not visible to the eye, a certain way he'd pause before answering, a heaviness in his gaze when he spoke about faith and loss. But when he returned home, he traded uniform for ministry, fear for purpose. He built his life on the promise that even after the darkest storms, grace could rebuild what was broken. His wife, Elaine, was the quiet force that kept it all together. She managed the church's charity drives, cooked for every funeral meal, and knew every child by name. People often said she had the kind of presence that could calm a room without saying a word. When she walked into the sanctuary on Sundays, the younger mothers would straighten their dresses, the men would nod respectfully, and David's eyes would soften every time he saw her. And then there was Katie, 10 years old, a burst of light in a town that didn't see much excitement. She loved the choir loft, the sound of the organ, and the way her father's voice echoed through the rafters when he spoke about heaven. She was bright, the kind of child who asked questions adults couldn't answer. "If heaven is perfect," she once asked during Bible study, "why do people cry when someone goes there?" David never forgot that question. He'd smiled and said, "Because love still hurts, even when it's holy." Eights. On that June morning, life in Ardmore moved as predictably as the turning of the church clock. The Langstons' front porch faced Main Street, their small blue house trimmed with white shutters and hanging flower baskets. David's study occupied the corner room, a neat desk, stacks of old theological books, and a photograph from his days in the Army. On the back of that photo, in faded ink, he'd written, "If I ever make it home, I'll make it count." Eights. He did. By all accounts, David's sermons drew people from miles away. Not because they were grand, but because they were human. He spoke about everyday struggles, bills, temptation, forgiveness. He didn't judge. He didn't boast. He simply reminded his congregation that the smallest acts of faith were often the loudest prayers. But even the calmest hearts can attract the storm. In the weeks leading up to the fateful Sunday, subtle things began to shift. Elaine noticed small disturbances, the feeling of being watched while she locked up the church after evening services, the faint smell of cigarette smoke near the back entrance, though no one in the congregation smoked there. Once, she found the side door unlocked at dawn, though she was sure she'd bolted it the night before. She mentioned it to David, but he brushed it off. "Probably one of the youth forgetting to close up," he'd said, smiling. But Elaine remembered the look in his eyes, not dismissive, just uneasy. And she wasn't alone. A few of the older parishioners had mentioned a man, someone they didn't recognize, sitting in the very last pew during a Wednesday night service a few weeks prior. He never sang, never bowed his head, just sat there staring at the pulpit. One deacon said he'd seen him lingering in the parking lot afterward, but when he turned around, the man was gone. In a town like Ardmore, strangers were rare, and mysteries even rarer. Still, life went on. The following Sundays came and went without incident. David prepared his sermons in the early hours before dawn. Katie helped Elaine bake lemon pies for the church fundraiser, and the town carried on believing that goodness could not be interrupted. If you'd been in Ardmore that week, you wouldn't have sensed anything unusual. The papers carried the same headlines: weather forecasts, local softball scores, a bake sale at the firehouse. But underneath that simplicity, something had already started unraveling. You can almost feel it in hindsight, a tension just out of sight, like the stillness before lightning strikes. On the night of June 10th, the Langstons had dinner together: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, sweet tea. David spent the evening in his study, marking his sermon notes with the usual precision. The topic for the next day's sermon was faith without fear. Katie kissed him goodnight, leaving a sticky fingerprint of jam on his Bible. He didn't wipe it off. Elaine would later recall that her husband seemed distracted that night. He kept glancing at the window, listening for something. When she asked what was wrong, he only smiled faintly and said, "Just making sure the world outside is still the same." Eights. That world, the small, predictable world of Ardmore, would never be the same again. The next morning, as sunlight broke over Main Street, the Langstons left their house together. Elaine carried a covered dish for the fellowship table. Katie skipped ahead, her white shoes tapping the pavement. David locked the front door, turned the key twice, a small habit he'd formed after Vietnam, and climbed into the driver's seat of their old Ford sedan. Neighbors saw them pass by, waving as they always did. To everyone watching, it was just another Sunday morning. If you'd been there, standing on that sidewalk, you might have noticed how David glanced in the rearview mirror more than once. You might have seen the way his knuckles tightened slightly on the steering wheel when a dark-colored pickup truck slowed at the intersection behind them, too far to read the plate, too close to ignore. But no one noticed. The Langstons parked by the church at 8:45. David greeted his congregation at the door, shaking hands, laughing, the way he always did. He led morning prayer, his voice steady, his faith unwavering. The choir sang Amazing Grace. Katie took her seat in the front pew, her small hands folded neatly in her lap. And somewhere, perhaps in the back pew, perhaps outside by the side door, someone else watched, unseen, waiting. Later, investigators would search through every inch of that church and find no trace of who it was. No fingerprints, no footprints, no sign of forced entry. Just the lingering sense that someone had been there all along, silent, patient, certain. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Inside those walls, there was only faith, warmth, and the sound of a father's voice echoing through the rafters, unaware that his final sermon was already being written in the shadows. The sanctuary clock struck 9:30, its slow mechanical tick echoing between the wooden rafters. Pastor David Langston's voice carried across the hall, smooth and deliberate, the kind of tone that made even restless children sit still. He spoke about fear, how it creeps in quietly, how faith is meant to outlast it. The morning sun poured through the stained glass windows, painting the walls in shifting hues of amber and gold. For those 42 worshipers, it was just another Sunday. Familiar faces filled every pew, farmers, teachers, retirees, mothers balancing toddlers on their laps. They knew every rhythm, the hymns, the prayers, the cadence of David's voice. When he spoke, it felt safe, predictable, eternal. And then, at precisely 9:47 a.m., the pattern broke. David paused mid-sentence, glancing toward the front row. His gaze found Katie, sitting beside Elaine, legs dangling above the floor, white shoes bright against the scuffed wood. She smiled, quick, innocent, fleeting. He smiled back. Then, in the next breath, he was gone. The first seconds were pure stillness. His Bible remained open on the pulpit, the microphone still alive, carrying only a low hum of static. The crowd waited, expecting a joke, a trick, something theatrical. David was known to step aside mid-sermon to illustrate a point. But this was different. His voice hadn't trailed off. It had cut off, mid-word. His presence vanished as if someone had snuffed out a flame. Elaine was the first to stand. "David?" Her voice trembled across the room. No answer. A few men rose, scanning behind the pulpit, the choir loft, the side hall that led to the pastor's office. Empty. The choir members exchanged nervous glances. Someone whispered, "Maybe he fainted." Another muttered, "Maybe he went backstage." But there was no backstage, just the pulpit, the wall, and a single door that hadn't opened once. Then came the sound, the collective murmur of disbelief. A few gasps, a few prayers, the rustle of clothes as people turned in their seats. The air felt heavier, thicker. Even the fans seemed to slow. Elaine stepped toward the pulpit. David's Bible lay open to Proverbs, a ribbon marker draped over the verse he'd been reading. His glasses rested beside it, perfectly folded. The microphone cable dangled off the stand, severed cleanly, as though it had been yanked, not unplugged. "David?" she called again. This time, her voice cracked. From the back pew, an usher hurried toward her. He must have stepped out the side door, Maybe an emergency. 8. But the door was locked from the inside. And that's when someone noticed the second absence. Katie's seat, the front row spot every churchgoer knew by heart, was empty. A chill rippled through the congregation. Elaine spun around. "Katie?" Her voice rang out across the sanctuary. No answer. No movement. Just the creak of old floorboards beneath hurried steps. Someone checked the hallway. Another ran to the Sunday school rooms. The choir searched the storage area behind the organ. The back exit was tested, still latched. The parking lot outside was empty except for the Langston sedan. It all happened in less than 3 minutes. 2 people, father and daughter, gone without a trace. By 9:52 a.m., panic had replaced prayer. Some shouted. Others wept. Elaine stood frozen, one hand gripping the pulpit, the other pressed to her chest as if holding her heart in place. The hum of the microphone still filled the room, a thin electric whisper that felt almost alive. If you'd been there, sitting among those pews, you'd remember the sound first, the unnatural quiet that follows sudden chaos. You'd remember the way light filtered through the stained glass, touching the empty space where David had stood seconds earlier. And you'd remember the realization that swept through the crowd like a fever. Something impossible had just happened. The first police unit arrived at 10:06 a.m. Officer Mark Denton, a 12-year veteran, stepped into the church expecting confusion, maybe a medical emergency, a heart attack, a runaway child. What he found instead was silence, and 42 people staring at a pulpit that felt more like a crime scene than a place of worship. "Who's missing?" he asked. "Pastor Langston." "And his daughter," Elaine managed to say. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the hymnal she'd clutched since the moment he vanished. "Did anyone see them leave?" 8. Dozens of heads shook. Not one. Denton walked behind the pulpit, examined the microphone cord, the Bible, the half-drunk glass of water on the stand. The glass hadn't spilled. The floor showed no signs of a struggle, no scuff marks, no overturned furniture. The pulpit area was immaculate, as though time had frozen mid-moment. Within an hour, Ardmore's small police force was overwhelmed. By noon, the county sheriff, 2 state troopers, and a pair of investigators from Oklahoma City had joined the search. The church was sealed off with yellow tape. Officers photographed every pew, every window, every door hinge. Volunteers combed the surrounding woods, calling the names David and Katie into the wind until their voices gave out. A K-9 unit was brought in around 2 p.m. The dogs picked up a faint scent near the pulpit, traced it down the side aisle, and stopped at the front doors, then nothing. The scent vanished completely, as though the trail simply evaporated. One officer whispered, "It's like they walked straight into thin air." 8. Another crossed himself. Outside, local reporters gathered. The story spread faster than the facts could catch up. By sunset, every television in southern Oklahoma carried the headline, "Pastor and daughter vanish during service." Inside the Langston home, Elaine sat surrounded by friends from the congregation, but her eyes never left the front window. She kept expecting to see headlights pull into the driveway, David's old Ford rolling up the gravel. Every sound, a car door, a bark, the ringing phone, made her flinch. Meanwhile, investigators tore through every theory they could imagine. Theory 1. Staged disappearance. Maybe David had run. Money problems, secret life, mental break. But his accounts were untouched, his car still parked at the church, his passport in the desk drawer. Theory 2. Kidnapping. But how? 40 witnesses. No sign of entry or exit. No ransom demand. No fingerprints but his own. Theory 3. Supernatural event. They didn't write that one down, but they whispered it, especially those who'd sat in the pews that day. By midnight, the case had moved from baffling to impossible. At 6 a.m., the next morning, a deputy found something half a mile down a gravel path behind the church, a pair of small white shoes. Katie's, and mud-stained, damp with dew, one lace untied. There were no footprints leading to or from them. Just the shoes, perfectly side by side, as if placed there deliberately. Elaine collapsed when she saw them. "She never took them off," she whispered. The find only deepened the mystery. There were no tire tracks nearby, no broken branches, no drag marks. Forensic teams photographed every angle, bagged the shoes, and found nothing, no blood, no hair, no fibers. By Tuesday, the Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation had taken over. The church was dusted, its foundation scanned, even its ventilation shafts checked. Nothing. Detectives tried to reconstruct every second. They measured the distance from the pulpit to the pews, calculated how long it would take for a person to exit unseen. Even at the fastest pace, it would have required at least 4 seconds, and 42 people swore they never looked away long enough for that to happen. One investigator later said, "You could blink, and they'd still be there. But when you opened your eyes, they were gone." 8. It became national news. Churches across the South prayed for the Langstons. Paranormal talk shows speculated about divine intervention, rapture, alien abduction. But the police stuck to evidence, or lack thereof. For weeks, Ardmore lived in suspended disbelief. Locals avoided the church, crossing the street rather than walking past it. Children whispered that the building was cursed. On warm nights, some swore they saw a light flicker in the pulpit, long after power had been cut off. Elaine stopped sleeping. She kept the porch light on, the back door unlocked, just in case they find their way home. 8. By July, the investigation had consumed every available lead. Officers canvassed nearby towns, interviewed former church members, checked David's war records, even called in experts from Quantico. Nothing connected. The disappearance of Pastor David and little Katie Langston defied logic, science, and faith alike. Weeks turned into months. Reporters left. Detectives filed their reports. Ardmore tried to move on, but the church bell never rang again. Years later, when retired agents revisited the case, they'd describe it as one of the most unnerving events they'd ever logged. No body, no witness, no evidence, one said. Just a room full of believers who swear the impossible happened right in front of them. 8. The file was eventually sealed, stored away in a metal cabinet alongside dozens of other unresolved mysteries. The label read simply, Langston, David and Katie, 1989, unexplained disappearance. It would become one of those stories whispered at crime conferences and forensic conventions, a benchmark for the inexplicable, the unsolved, the cases that keep detectives awake long after retirement. It was the kind of event that would one day haunt every cold case files investigator. And for Elaine Langston, the wife who never stopped waiting, it wasn't a case at all. It was a hole in the world where her family used to be. How does someone vanish in front of 40 witnesses? That question would echo through Ardmore for decades, unanswered, haunting, eternal. By sunrise Monday, Ardmore no longer felt like Ardmore. Police cruisers idled outside First Baptist. Reporters pressed against barricades. Search dogs barked into the still air, their paws kicking up dust from the churchyard. The once sacred ground now looked like a construction site of grief, marked grids, numbered cones, flashes of camera light slicing through the morning fog. Inside the sanctuary, the air smelled of chemicals and sweat. Crime scene techs moved silently through the aisles, snapping photos, dusting the pulpit, bagging items that might matter later: David's Bible, his glasses, the severed microphone cable. Every movement felt invasive, like touching a ghost that might still be watching. Detective Ron Everett, leading the investigation for the Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation, leaned over the altar rail and whispered, "If there's an answer, it's hiding in plain sight." Eights. No one replied. They were too busy listening to the silence that seemed to hum back at them. See? The first 48 hours were a blur of confusion and contradiction. The doors had remained locked from the inside. No fingerprints beyond the congregation's own. No broken locks. No tire tracks in the lot. The K-9 units followed a faint trail from the pulpit to the front door, and then nothing. Forensics found traces of dust disturbance on the wood floor directly behind the pulpit, but the pattern didn't match human footprints. It was as if the dust had been displaced by a gust of wind from nowhere. By Tuesday afternoon, the church was emptied and cordoned off. The sanctuary lights flicked on and off as evidence teams worked shifts through the night. People passing by could see their silhouettes moving behind the stained glass like restless spirits. Detectives interviewed every witness twice. Their stories were identical. One moment, Pastor Langston was mid-sentence. The next, he was gone. There was no sound, no thud, no door creak, no scream. The choir swore the microphone kept humming for several seconds after his disappearance. Katie's vanishing, only minutes later, made no sense even by abduction standards. Elaine had been sitting right beside her. She turned her head for half a second when someone gasped behind them. When she looked back, the pew was empty. By midweek, Ardmore became a hive of outside voices. FBI agents, state troopers, and a flood of journalists transformed the quiet town into a circus of speculation. News trucks lined Main Street. Satellite dishes pointed skyward. Every diner conversation turned into a theory. At Langston's home, reporters camped on the lawn until an officer told them to leave. Elaine barely spoke. She sat in David's study, staring at the open Bible he'd marked the night before. Faith without fear. The bookmark was still damp from his touch. On the fourth day, the town gathered for a candlelight vigil outside the police station. Dozens prayed for divine answers. Others demanded practical ones. A woman from the congregation said, "If the Lord took them, why leave their shoes behind?" Eights. The question split the town in two. Half believed something holy had happened. The other half whispered about crime, kidnapping, ritual, murder. Detective Everett hated the word miracle. He preferred evidence. But each passing day gave him less of it, so by the end of June, the case had crossed state lines. Helicopters scanned forest canopies. Officers dragged nearby lakes. They searched drainage tunnels, truck stops, and farm sheds within a 50-mile radius. 1,000 man-hours yielded nothing except exhaustion. The closest thing to a lead came from a highway patrolman who claimed he'd seen a pickup matching the description of a dark truck idling near the church that morning. But when traced, the plate belonged to a farm vehicle 2 counties over. A dead end like all the rest. Elaine rode along in one of the early searches, sitting silently in the back seat. At one point, she asked the officer driving, "Do you think they're together?" Eights. He hesitated before answering. Ma'am, I think wherever they are, they didn't go willingly. Eights. That was the last time she left the house for months. Inside the OBI lab, the evidence spread across metal tables looked pitifully small. One Bible, one pair of shoes, several photographs, and residue samples that revealed nothing unusual. The lab chief described it as a case built on air. Eights. Meanwhile, the town's ministers met to discuss how to comfort a congregation afraid to worship. They agreed to close First Baptist indefinitely. Its keys were handed over to law enforcement until the Lord or the law says otherwise. Eights. When Everett returned to the building weeks later to check on the structure, he noticed something strange. The pulpit wood, once polished smooth, had warped slightly, one narrow split down its center like a lightning scar. He touched it, then quickly pulled his hand back. The surface felt colder than the air around it. He never mentioned that detail in his report. July brought relentless coverage. Headlines read, Pastor and child vanish in front of 40 witnesses. Talk shows debated divine intervention versus mass hysteria. A late-night host even joked about the Oklahoma rapture, drawing laughs that turned to backlash within hours. For weeks, Ardmore became a symbol of unexplained loss. The locals hated it. Their tragedy had become television's curiosity. Out-of-towners drove in just to take photos of the church. Some knelt at its locked doors as if expecting to disappear themselves. Elaine's grief turned to quiet anger. She avoided interviews, but one camera caught her whispering, "You all treat this like a story. But for me, it's every breath I take." Eights. By August, the news cycle had moved on. The cameras left. The silence stayed. Without David and Katie, time stopped having meaning. Elaine stopped marking days on the calendar. Meals went untouched. The house dimmed, curtains stayed drawn. Neighbors left groceries on her porch, though most went bad before she opened the door. Detectives still called occasionally, each time with hope, each time leaving her more hollow. "We found a possible lead," they'd say. She would sit up, pulse racing. Hours later, the same voice would return, quieter. "Sorry, ma'am, it wasn't them." She began keeping a notebook on the table beside her chair. Dates, names, false promises. By the end of 1990, there were 112 entries. The last one read, "He smiled at her. That's how I'll remember them." At night, the church across the street stood dark except for the moonlight glinting off its cross. Elaine sometimes imagined she saw movement inside, just enough to make her heart leap. But when she blinked, the shadow was gone. Grief can create its own miracles. Terrible, lonely miracles. By early 1990, the investigation team was running on fumes. Everett filed 76 separate witness statements, 11 forensic requests, and 19 search warrants. None yielded progress. Each detective had a theory. One believed the Langstons were victims of a cult. Another thought David, haunted by Vietnam, had staged a disappearance to start over. A third whispered about something not human. Eights. They argued late into the night, their coffee cooling between them. Everett slammed his fist once and said, "Stop calling it impossible. Everything's possible until it's proved otherwise." Eights. But even he couldn't find proof. When he reviewed the case logs months later, he noticed something unsettling. The timestamp on the church security system, an old analog recorder stored in the back office, had jumped forward exactly 3 minutes during the sermon, erasing the moment of disappearance entirely. No mechanical explanation was ever found. The church remained sealed for 2 years. Grass grew wild along its foundation. Vandals spray-painted "They're Still Here" on the back wall before it was scrubbed off. By 1991, attendance at every nearby church had fallen by half. Faith had turned brittle. The disappearance had cracked something in the collective heart of Ardmore. Marriages ended. Businesses closed. The Langston case became both cautionary tale and curse. You can't live long in a town haunted by questions. Most people simply moved away. Those who stayed avoided the subject entirely. If you mentioned the pastor's name in conversation, voices lowered automatically, as if speaking it aloud might reopen the wound. Hope kept reappearing only to vanish again. 1990, the Texas tip. A farmer south of Dallas claimed to have seen a man and girl walking near his property at dusk. Their clothes were described as Sunday best. Investigators arrived within hours. No trace. In 1991, the cult theory resurfaces. Letters appeared in the local paper from a self-proclaimed prophet warning that the shepherd and the lamb have been taken for cleansing. The handwriting matched that of a former janitor from First Baptist, Edward Thomas. He'd left Ardmore in 1987 after being fired for erratic behavior. Detectives tried to locate him, but his trail ended somewhere in Idaho. The lead went dormant. 1992, the tape. A cassette arrived anonymously at OBI headquarters containing a recording of a man reading Psalm 23 while a child softly hummed. The accent, the tone, eerily similar to David's. When tested, the audio proved too degraded for voice match confirmation. Postmark: Denver, Colorado. 1993, the confessor. A drifter arrested in Kansas claimed he freed the preacher from sin. He gave detailed descriptions of the church layout that turned out mostly correct, information available from newspapers. He recanted 2 days later, calling it a vision. Eights, 1994, the mirage. A tourist photo taken in Santa Fe captured a man who looked exactly like David, standing beside a small girl. Investigators traced the image. A case of mistaken identity, father and daughter from Arizona. Each year ended the same way. Renewed hope collapsing into silence. By 1994, Elaine had become the last keeper of her own ghost story. Her house smelled of old wood and unopened windows. The television stayed on day and night for company. The mailbox overflowed with church letters, sympathy cards, and strangers' prayers. She kept David's office untouched. His sermon notes remained stacked neatly on the desk, each page dated, each verse underlined. One notebook stopped abruptly at June 10th, his last completed message. On the final page, in his handwriting, Eights. Faith is trusting what you cannot see, even when what you see is gone. Eights. She traced those words every night before bed. Neighbors sometimes saw her walking barefoot across the street to the church fence, whispering to the wind as if delivering her own sermon. No one listened for long. It hurt too much. By late 1994, the investigation budget had dried up. Boxes of evidence were transferred to Oklahoma City for archiving. Photographs faded. Reports yellowed. The Langston file, 5 binders thick, was stamped with a single word: inactive. Detective Everett, now gray-haired and tired, closed the cabinet drawer himself. He stood for a long moment before sliding the label into place. By 94, the Langston case was sealed away among thousands of unsolved disappearances, another folder in the cold case files. Eights. He left the room with a distinct feeling he'd buried something alive. The case number would remain untouched for almost 2 decades, gathering dust while technology evolved. New crimes filled headlines, and the town that once prayed for miracles stopped praying altogether. Ardmore entered the new decade smaller, quieter, older. The church's paint peeled. Vines climbed the steeple. Local kids dared each other to peek through the boards at night, claiming to hear faint whispers. Elaine refused to move away. "If they come home," she said once to a visiting reporter, "I want them to find me right where they left me." Ease. By then, she rarely smiled. But sometimes she would hum softly, a tune Katie used to hum during Sunday service. Neighbors recognized it through their open windows and turned off their lights. Some said they felt ashamed listening. Faith had become a private language, spoken only in whispers. In 1995, after retiring, Everett returned to the church one last time. The boards had loosened, the door half rotted. Inside, dust floated like snow in the sunlight. He walked to the pulpit, laid a hand on its surface, and closed his eyes. For a moment, he imagined hearing David's voice again, steady, calm, unafraid. Then he whispered, "I never stopped looking." 8. When he left, he slipped a small note between the pages of the open Bible, still stored in evidence. 8. Some faiths begin with proof. Others begin with silence. 8. That note was never logged officially. But years later, when the case resurfaced, investigators found it preserved inside the same Bible, untouched by time. And so, for nearly 24 years, the Langston disappearance remained frozen, a story without an ending, a wound without a scar. It would take a chance discovery hundreds of miles away, in a forgotten corner of Colorado, to thaw the silence and reveal the first tangible trace of what really happened to Pastor David and little Katie. But before that revelation, there was only the quiet, an entire generation of unanswered prayers, and one woman's refusal to stop believing that somewhere, beyond the reach of reason, her family was still waiting to be found. For 24 years, the Langston case slept like a sealed tomb. Then, in 2013, a park ranger's discovery of a rusted necklace in the Colorado wilderness cracked that tomb open, and with it, the name that investigators had almost forgotten: Edward Thomas. Before he vanished from Ardmore, Edward Thomas had been a fixture at First Baptist Church. He swept its floors, polished its pews, and mowed the grass that surrounded the white-steepled sanctuary. To most, he was invisible, a thin, quiet man who moved like dust through morning light. But David Langston noticed him. He always said thank you, always asked how Thomas was doing. Those small gestures mattered more than David would ever know. Thomas was 43 when he first started working at the church. A Vietnam veteran like David, though his story was darker. He'd served as a radio operator, stationed in the dense forests of Quang Tri Province. The static of his headset had once saved his life, a single burst of interference that warned of incoming fire. But somewhere between the screams and the silence, his mind had split. Back home, he drifted through short-term jobs and longer-term loneliness. His discharge papers mentioned hallucinations under stress. No one followed up. At First Baptist, he found routine, order, and, above all, Scripture. The pastor's voice became his compass. David Langston preached about forgiveness, about cleansing sin through love. To Edward Thomas, those words weren't metaphor, they were command. He'd linger after services, wiping down the pews long after everyone else left, whispering the verses to himself. "Purify me, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow." 8. Sometimes he'd close his eyes and imagine light pouring through him, burning away every stain he'd carried from the jungle. It began as admiration. Thomas kept a notebook filled with David's sermon quotes, copied in neat block letters. Over time, admiration turned into obsession, a belief that David was a prophet, chosen to finish what war had interrupted. He started following the Langstons after church, quietly at first. He'd sit in his truck outside their house, engine off, radio static hissing in the background. In his delusion, he believed the static wasn't random. He thought it was God speaking in code. You tell yourself God is whispering through the static, that only you can cleanse the impure. You turn the dial until the noise sharpens. You hear fragments of words that aren't really there. Take them, save them, deliver them. You believe he's giving you a mission. Edward Thomas began to record those whispers. Cassette tapes filled with radio hiss and fragments of his own trembling voice. Later, investigators would find dozens of them hidden in a trunk near his Colorado cabin, labeled by hand. The Calling One, the Blood Test, the Shepherd. Eights. To outsiders, they were meaningless noise. To Thomas, they were scripture written in static. By 1987, his behavior at the church had become erratic. He started locking himself inside after hours. Members reported hearing him muttering during sermons. Once, he interrupted a youth Bible class to declare that the Lord's vessel has been tainted by worldly eyes. Tss. David confronted him gently, asking if he was all right. Thomas said he'd been receiving instructions. When David suggested he take time off, Thomas's expression hardened. You're afraid of the truth, Pastor, but you'll see. We'll all see. Eights. A week later, the church board dismissed him quietly. No one called the police. No one warned Elaine. He packed his belongings into an old Ford pickup and disappeared down Highway 70, leaving behind only a set of keys and a single page from his notebook. Eights. When the shepherd sleeps, the lamb will follow. Eights. That line would take on new meaning years later. In the spring of 1989, witnesses recalled a stranger sitting in the back pew during Wednesday night services. A man with thinning hair and a gray coat despite the summer heat. He never spoke. He only watched the pulpit. Police later matched the description to Edward Thomas. He had returned to Ardmore without anyone noticing, living out of his truck, sleeping behind the abandoned sawmill on Route 77. Locals would later remember seeing the vehicle parked near the church more than once in those weeks. From his vantage point, Thomas could see the steeple through the trees. He wrote in his journal, fragments recovered from the Colorado cabin decades later. Eights. He preaches of fear as sin. He must learn fear to be clean. The child is unspoiled. The lamb must lead the shepherd through the fire. Eights. The handwriting grew increasingly unstable, letters doubling, words slanting off the page. He believed David had betrayed the message, had made faith too soft, too forgiving. And if God's message couldn't reach the pastor, Thomas would deliver it himself. What happened inside First Baptist that June morning has never been fully explained. But the fragments found later suggest Thomas planned it meticulously. Investigators uncovered a blueprint of the church, hand-drawn, with arrows pointing to the pulpit and front pew. In the margins, he'd written, "Through the light, not through the door." Eights. One theory holds that Thomas had built a hidden crawlspace beneath the pulpit years earlier when helping renovate the floorboards. But no such space was ever located. Another theory, the one whispered among investigators, suggested he used smoke grenades or flash distraction, exploiting the congregation's momentary blindness. Yet even that couldn't account for how both father and daughter vanished without anyone hearing movement. Whatever the method, it began with faith and ended in delusion. To Thomas, it wasn't abduction, it was ascension. In his fractured mind, he believed he'd rescued David and Katie from corruption. The world wasn't ready for them, he later said in interrogation. They were too pure. I kept them away like he told me. Eights. Those words, flat and unemotional, still echo in case recordings today. Psychiatrists later described Edward Thomas as suffering from schizoaffective disorder compounded by religious trauma and wartime psychosis. He heard divine messages in white noise. He saw symbols in light and shadow. He believed every coincidence was prophecy. But to understand him, you have to step inside that mind, if only for a moment. You wake before dawn. The world is still. The air hums like an electrical current. You turn on your radio, and the static fills the room. To others, it's nothing. To you, it's God breathing. You write down every pulse, every crackle. You see meaning in the silence between stations. You believe you are chosen, not blessed, but burdened. And when you look at the pastor and his daughter, you see more than people. You see symbols, the shepherd, the lamb. You believe they must be taken from the noise of the world to hear the true signal. Faith becomes mission. Mission becomes obsession. Obsession becomes inevitability. After the Langstons vanished, Edward Thomas drove west. Records show he withdrew $108 from a bank in Wichita Falls, bought supplies in Amarillo, then vanished again until 2013. The necklace and later discoveries would place him in the forests of southern Colorado, living in a derelict firewatch cabin, isolated, surrounded by the echoes of his own recordings. When investigators finally reached the site, they found evidence of years of occupation. Empty food cans, a decayed Bible, and tapes stacked in neat piles. One tape stood out. Labeled Deliverance, June 1989. Eights. The voice on it was steady, almost calm. The shepherd has been freed. The child walks with light. The world cannot see them. The world must never see them. Eights. In the background, faintly, came the sound of a child's laugh, followed by silence and the click of the recorder stopping. No other tapes mentioned Katie again. When police located Edward Thomas in 2014, he was living under an alias in a small Idaho town. He hadn't run. He hadn't hidden. He'd simply been waiting. Neighbors described him as polite but odd, a man who spoke to his television during storms and burned candles at exactly 7:47 p.m. each night. When the officers arrived, he didn't resist. In the interrogation room, Thomas spoke with eerie calm. "I saved them," he said. "You call it murder, but it was mercy. The world wasn't ready. He told me so." Eights. He referred to he constantly, refusing to clarify whether it meant God or some voice of his own invention. When asked where Katie was, he smiled faintly. She followed the light. The lamb always leads. Eights. After hours of questioning, he gave a single verifiable clue, the location of the Colorado cabin. There, investigators found the remains later confirmed to be David's, along with Katie's diary and Thomas's tapes. During psychological evaluation, Thomas displayed no remorse. He believed he had fulfilled a divine purpose. "They're not gone," he said. "They're waiting for the rest of us to listen." Eights. He died in 2016 in a state psychiatric facility, still quoting scripture into the static of a broken radio. In the years since, criminologists have studied the Langston case as a textbook example of religious delusion intersecting with moral obsession. Thomas's fixation on purity mirrored countless cult leaders and zealots who blur the line between faith and control. But what made him uniquely terrifying was his sincerity. He didn't seek power, wealth, or fame. He sought cleansing. That's the most chilling kind of madness, the one that dresses itself in holiness. Even now, psychologists debate whether Thomas's disorder created his faith or whether his faith accelerated his disorder. The two became inseparable, a feedback loop where belief fed delusion and delusion reinforced belief. Some call it psychosis. Others call it possession. Either way, the result was the same. A man who mistook salvation for sacrifice. When Elaine Langston was shown a photo of Edward Thomas after his arrest, she didn't recognize him. But when investigators played a short clip of his voice, the word deliverance repeated softly, she began to cry. "I remember that word," she said. David used it in his last sermon. Eights. That coincidence still haunts detectives. How much did Thomas hear? How long had he been listening? In the end, he left behind no grand explanation, no map, no closure, only the endless whisper of the tapes, the hum of static between channels, and a reminder that sometimes the line between revelation and ruin is only as thin as faith itself. Edward Thomas's confession brought partial answers, but not peace. Only one body was found. Katie's trail ended at that cabin, her small diary the final voice in a chorus of silence. As investigators turned to DNA to confirm what time had eroded, the story shifted once again, from madness to science, from belief to proof. Because in the end, it would be technology, not faith, that spoke for the dead, and reopened one of America's most haunting entries in the cold case files. For nearly a quarter of a century, the Langston disappearance was little more than a cautionary whisper, a mystery too strange to solve, too painful to forget. Then, in the spring of 2013, the wilderness gave up its secret. April 6th, 2013. Alan Rivers, a retired park ranger, was hiking a remote stretch of forest near the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in southern Colorado, a region of steep ridges, pine tangles, and forgotten fire roads. He'd spent decades in those woods, knew every scent, every sound. That morning, as he cleared brush near a fallen pine, something metallic caught the sunlight. At first, he thought it was a soda tab. But when he knelt and brushed away the dirt, he found a small locket, heart-shaped, rusted, its chain fused to the soil. On its back, barely legible beneath the grime, were words etched by a trembling hand. Eights. To my Katie, love, Dad. Proverbs 3:5. The verse read, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding." Eights. Alan pocketed it gently, not yet knowing the weight it carried. That evening, when he cleaned it and the inscription became clear, he contacted the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. Within days, the artifact was traced back to an unsolved missing persons report from 1989, the Langston case. The call reached Oklahoma within a week. Detective Ron Everett, long retired, received the news first. His hands trembled as he held the photo of the locket. "It's hers," he whispered. "I remember Elaine showing me that necklace in our first interview. She said David gave it to Katie the day she was baptized." Eights. The case file, dormant since 1994, was pulled from the archives, pages brittle, photographs faded. But for the first time in 24 years, there was movement. Investigators from Colorado and Oklahoma joined forces, following the Rangers' map to the coordinates where the locket had been found. It was deep country, a 3-hour hike through uneven terrain, where even the wind seemed to hold its breath. At the edge of a collapsed ridge, half buried beneath a fallen tree, they found what looked like the remnants of an old fire-watch cabin. The logs had rotted, the roof long gone, but something about the site felt undisturbed, as if time had simply stopped. The team entered cautiously. Dust motes spun in the sunlight, filtering through broken boards. Inside lay the artifacts of a life lived in exile, rusted tools, tin cans, a moldy sleeping bag. But it was the object near the collapsed shelf that silenced everyone. A cracked leather suitcase, its clasp corroded shut. When they pried it open, the air filled with the musty scent of time. Inside were fragments of clothing, a mold-stained hymnal, and sheets of paper, pages of a sermon written in David Langston's precise, looping handwriting. At the top of the first page, the date read, June 12th, 1989, the day after he vanished. Beneath the papers lay a small notebook, its cover softened by years of moisture. The handwriting was round, uneven, a child's. When investigators opened it, the first page read, "8s. Daddy prayed today. I miss Mommy." 8s. Katie's diary. The entries began simple, drawings of flowers, notes about daily prayers, small expressions of homesickness. But as the pages went on, the handwriting grew shakier. The tone shifted. "Mr. Thomas brought us bread and water today. 8s. Daddy says we'll go home soon. 8s. The forest is cold at night. 8s. Daddy says to keep writing so I won't be scared. 8s. The final entry, dated June 30th, read, 8s. Daddy says we're safe for now, but I miss home. 8s. It was the last trace of her voice. Forensic analysts confirmed the paper, and ink dated back to the late 1980s. The diary alone was enough to reopen the investigation nationwide. The search team expanded their grid around the cabin. Just 20 yards away, beneath a layer of fallen needles, they found what remained of a man's skeleton. The body was partially mummified, the leather belt still intact, a small cross pendant hanging near the ribs. Dental records confirmed what Elaine had feared and long suspected. Pastor David Langston had been found. He died of blunt force trauma. The coroner couldn't say whether it was accident or assault. Beside him, wrapped in brittle plastic, were his final sermon notes, preserved by the dryness of the mountain air. The words at the bottom of the last page read, 8s. Even in the darkest silence, he still hears. 8s. It was both a prayer and a goodbye. Nearly a year after the discovery, the FBI traced a bank withdrawal from the late 1980s to a man living in northern Idaho under the name Ed Thomason. The date and location matched Edward Thomas's last known movements. When agents arrived at his small rental cabin, Thomas was sitting by a radio, tuning through static. He looked older, but calm, almost expectant. When asked about the Langstons, he didn't hesitate. "They were chosen," he said. "I took them because he asked me to. They were too pure for what was coming." 8s. He described leading them from the church through a side door the congregation couldn't see, taking them north, feeding them, praying with them, preparing them for deliverance. 8s. He never explained what deliverance meant. "I didn't kill him," Thomas said softly. "He just stopped hearing the message. I buried him so he could listen better." 8s. When pressed about Katie, he smiled faintly. "The lamb follows the light. She didn't need me anymore." 8s. Investigators said he never raised his voice, never showed remorse. His version of the story was detached, theological, as if quoting scripture no one else could see. The remains from Colorado were transferred to the University of North Texas's Center for Human Identification. Forensic anthropologists confirmed the skeletal features matched David's military dental charts. DNA extracted from a preserved hair strand confirmed it beyond doubt. Katie's DNA, however, was only present in trace amounts, on the diary, on the necklace, but no remains were found. Despite exhaustive searches, no other human remains were recovered within 5 miles of the site. It was enough for closure, but not for peace. When investigators came to Elaine's door that May, she already seemed to know. She'd seen the news, the necklace, the diary, the mention of a man named Thomas. But hearing the confirmation from their lips broke something in her she had been holding for 24 years. She listened silently as they spoke. Then she asked one question. Ates. Was she alone when it happened? Ates. The agent hesitated, then answered honestly. Ates. No, ma'am. She was with her father. Ates. Elaine nodded once. Tears slid down her cheeks, but her voice didn't waver. Then she wasn't afraid. Ates. Later that week, when she was shown the recovered items, she reached for the necklace first. Her fingers brushed the rusted chain, trembling as though touching the pulse of memory itself. He gave this to her, she whispered. She never took it off. He told her it would remind her to trust, even when she couldn't see. Ates. She pressed it to her chest and closed her eyes. In July 2014, the Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation held a joint press conference with the Colorado authorities. They confirmed the discovery of David Langston's remains and identified Edward Thomas as the perpetrator. The headline ran across national outlets. Ates. Langston cold case solved after 24 years. Faith, madness, and forensics collide. Ates. Detective Everett, brought out of retirement to attend, stood at the podium, his voice breaking slightly as he said, Ates. After 24 years in the cold case files, science finally spoke louder than silence. Ates. The room went quiet. Reporters, for once, had no follow-up questions. The story spoke for itself. That summer, David Langston was brought home to Ardmore. The town that had once turned away from its church gathered again, not in fear, but in reverence. The church doors, unopened for decades, were finally unlocked. The pews had warped, the pulpit was cracked, but the bell still hung above, waiting. On July 20th, 2014, it rang one last time. Elaine walked down the center aisle, holding the locket and a folded handkerchief. Behind her, townspeople stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces reflecting the same mixture of sorrow and relief. Detective Everett sat near the back. As the ceremony ended, he whispered a prayer he hadn't said in years. Ates. Let the light find the lost. Ates. When Elaine stepped to the pulpit, she didn't read from scripture. She simply looked at the congregation, many of them the same faces who'd witnessed the unthinkable all those years ago. David used to say that faith isn't about knowing, she said softly. It's about waiting. I waited 24 years, and I still believe. Ates. Her voice trembled but never broke. My husband is home now. And my little girl, wherever she is, she's not lost. She's just ahead of us. That night, Elaine placed the necklace and David's final sermon notes inside a small wooden box. She set it on the church altar and left it there, unsealed. The next morning, sunlight broke through the cracked stained glass, hitting the box directly. For a brief moment, the metal heart of the locket shimmered, as if reflecting something unseen. No one in Ardmore could explain it. Some said it was coincidence, others called it grace. But for Elaine, it didn't matter. For the first time in 24 years, the silence felt different. Not empty, just still. The story of Pastor David and Katie Langston had finally found its ending. And though the pain remained, so did the message David had preached his whole life. That light, even when distant, always finds its way through the dark. As the town of Ardmore began to heal, the Langston story rippled far beyond Oklahoma. True crime circles, forensic programs, and believers alike debated its meaning, faith, delusion, redemption, and the strange places where all three collide. But for those who lived it, the mystery wasn't about the vanishing, it was about what endured after. Because sometimes justice isn't loud. Sometimes it arrives like a whisper from the past, carried through science, memory, and faith, reminding us that even the coldest cases can still find warmth in the truth. In the months following the memorial, Ardmore began to breathe again. Slowly, cautiously, like a town waking from a long, dark sleep. The grass around First Baptist grew green once more. The cracked windows were replaced. The bell tower, once silent for decades, was repaired by volunteers, not because they expected it to ring again, but because they wanted to remember what it had sounded like. For 24 years, that church had been a wound. Now it became something else, a scar, still visible, but no longer bleeding. Elaine continued to live in the same blue house across the street. She never remarried, never left town. People often saw her sitting on her porch at dusk, a cup of tea in hand, the old locket resting against her palm. Some evenings she would look toward the church and smile, not sadly, but softly, like someone watching the tide after a storm finally recede. In her final interview with reporters, she was asked if she forgave Edward Thomas. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she traced the rim of the teacup with her finger, eyes distant. Forgiveness, she finally said, isn't about erasing what happened. It's about deciding it doesn't get to own you anymore. I think I've carried them long enough. It's time to let them walk on their own. Eights. Her words carried more grace than most could muster in a lifetime. The reporter asked if she still went to church. Elaine smiled faintly. Every day, she said, just not always inside a building. On the first anniversary of David's reburial, the townspeople gathered again, fewer than before, but united. The steeple had been restored, the pews cleaned, the pulpit reinforced. At precisely 9:47 a.m., the exact moment David had vanished 25 years earlier, the bell rang out over Main Street. One by one, people stopped in their tracks, at the diner, in their cars, at their windows, and listened. The sound rolled through the hills, deep and resonant, fading into the wind like a benediction. No one spoke. No one needed to. For those who had lived through that summer in 1989, the bell was both a farewell and a beginning. It marked not the loss of faith, but its quiet return. Detective Everett was there, standing in the back. He watched as sunlight poured through the stained glass and reflected on the wooden floor. For a moment, it almost looked like two figures, a man and a small child, walking down the aisle toward the door. When he blinked, the light was gone. Later, he wrote in his journal, "Eights. Closure isn't the end of pain. It's the moment you learn to carry it differently." Some stories don't end with justice. Some don't end with truth. They end with peace, fragile, incomplete, but peace nonetheless. The Langston case was one of them. It began with faith and ended with science, yet somewhere between those two, it reminded us of what it means to keep believing even when the evidence is gone. Faith isn't always holy. Sometimes it's desperate, raw, human. A mother keeping the porch light on, a detective refusing to close a file, a town ringing its bell after 24 years of silence. And maybe that's what makes stories like this linger. Not the mystery of disappearance, but the endurance of love in its wake. When the church doors finally closed again, the congregation left candles burning on the steps. Each one flickered in the wind, their flames bending but never going out. They stayed lit long after dusk, glowing like small hearts refusing to surrender to the dark. You think about that. About a father who smiled at his daughter one last time. About a mother who waited half a lifetime for the sound of footsteps that never came. And about a man who mistook madness for divinity. And then you ask yourself, Eights, if it were your town, could you ever feel safe again? If this story moved you, honor David and Katie's memory by giving this video a like, sharing it with someone who believes that truth never dies, and subscribing for more cold case files that refuse to stay buried. Because somewhere, right now, another mystery waits, another family still listening for a bell that hasn't rung in years. And maybe, just maybe, science and faith will meet again and bring them home.